All right, everyone. The cats this morning are being really wild and woolly because it's kind of cool at the moment, so they're chasing each other around. You might hear some scrabbly noises as they shoot across the floor. They've become chonky, and so it takes them a few tries to get up the momentum. So they sit there, and it's like they have to build up steam, and it's like the cutest thing ever. We got to talk about Biden again. I know it's a popular subject, not just because he's running for the presidency, but because he's the gaffe master in chief if he wins. It'd be a little bit like Bushisms, only arguably less funny because, of course, having a senile person wander into the war room and start pressing random buttons probably isn't anyone's idea of anything other than a good comedy movie. Now, Biden is lost in a racial jungle at the moment because all the stuff that he said in like the 70s and 80s and shit is coming back to haunt him. The problem for his candidacy, as I've explained, the worst thing about it isn't even the dementia. Arguably, he could get away with that better as long as his policies from the past couldn't haunt him because they were no longer out of lockstep with the Democrats. The thing is, in the wake of Bernie's run in 2016, you have a burgeoning leftist core within the Democratic Party. This is why the Dems have dysfunction. You have the business Dems, which are a minority within the party, but sizable, and left-leaning independents, I'd argue. You have the leftist Democrats, the Bernie Bros, the Warrenites, and so forth that want more, socialist policies. And then you have like the neoliberal core where Biden fits in. Biden has to try to go to the right and the left at the same time, and it's not working. The problem is that if he runs on his record, that can definitely help with some independence, but then it pisses off the left. If he doesn't bring up his record, he can pretend that he's suddenly become a progressive after 50 years in office or some crazy time like 45 years or something like that. But that's not really going to play well to the independents because it'll look like he's wooing communism. So he's got these comments, and this was regards busing. This was a policy back then to try to integrate schools by busing kids of different ethnic backgrounds into different districts to try to get people to artificially diversify. Now, preface to this, and people on like the further right, actually, they're like, oh, I would have voted for 70s Biden. He sounds sane. Technically speaking, you cannot fault Biden for these statements on a policy subject. Where I fault him is on principle. Here's why. It is true that busing was an abysmal failure. It's true that it didn't hold up to scrutiny. It was pointless. And Biden's opposition to it, and he prefaces this in different clips other than this one, other than the one involving the racial jungle, he qualifies and says, look, I was, a constitutional defense attorney. I defended the civil rights movement stuff, which is true. He did these things. It's like when they try to trot out that clip of him saying the N-word, he's actually quoting someone else. Biden was a sort of a civil rights progressive guy. The problem is this. In the context, if you listen to what he's saying, in this particular statement, he's opposing busing. But the policy, which is opposing busing, is fine, but the principle seems to be that he's afraid that his kids are going to end up going to a school with black children or something. So it's the principle, it's not really the policy. That being said, the racial jungle statements that people keep bringing up and chuckling about Joe Biden are arguably less effective than some of the other weird shit that he said. Like, he's still making these mistakes. The problem is, back then, he could at least deliver a coherent speech. He's very well spoken. If you listen to clips of Biden from the 70s, 80s, 90s, he's actually one of the better speakers from Congress. He's better at off-the-cuff speaking than the average politician. Is he today? No. So not only does so the biggest problem is when he tries to do humor, right? Like when he says, you ain't black to Charlemagne the God there, who has told him to shut the fuck up forever because of his additional gaffe regarding declaring Trump the first racist president. That was a real winner. Mostly focus on the new gaffes because this is contemporary Biden a la pretending to be a progressive and he's still saying weird shit. Stuff from the 70s, while it has come back to haunt him, stuff like this, you have to keep them in context. And sometimes you have to pick apart what's being proposed and how is it sort of formulated. And that's what I do for this. I can't fault him for opposing busing. I would have opposed it too because there's a nonsensical policy. Completely harebrained scheme that really nobody liked. the non-white communities, the white communities, it created unity. It created unity of the hatred of busing. And I think Lionel has actually had a chat about this actually too. I think he addressed this and he was like, well, look, I remember that time period and I think he did and he'd studied it at least and it was an abysmal failure. It didn't make any sense. With Biden though, it's the way that he's posing it. He's insinuating, at least in a crowd of largely white, upper middle class and rich people, he's addressing it as though his primary concern has nothing to do with the constitutional nature of busing, the pragmatism, whether it will be helpful. It appears that in this particular quote, in or out of context, it appears that he's primarily just worried about integration in and of itself. Oh, the school will have a 10% black kid population. My kids will be in a jungle. The insinuation using the word jungle in that particular context, can you imagine if Trump had said something like this in the 70s? Which he didn't, by the way. He was busy not caring about the fact that blacks and Jews were trying to sign up for his country club. In Florida, is it not true? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that I did hear that the Mar-a-Lago, or one of his resorts down there, was the first one that was technically fully integrated and would accept people who were black and Jewish. Because a lot of people, the upper middle class, largely white and maybe East Asian gated community, they're a very exclusive club. They stick up their noses at people, like they wouldn't let me in. You know, I've got long hair, I'm wearing a Hawaiian shirt, they probably wouldn't let me in either unless I paid them blood money. I'd have to have more fuck you money in order to get into most of these resorts, despite the fact that I'm white, by the way. Well, I'm Elizabeth Warren. I'm actually probably 1/16 Native American, so I guess maybe, do they have affirmative action now at country clubs? Some of them do, probably. Those run by Democrats. They get a token so they can look more diverse. Oh, look how progressive we are. We've got a black person who joined us. You know, we've been open for 100 years, and it was always entirely white dudes, usually older. But you know, now we're diverse. We're integrated. Yeah, he has a Harvard PhD. It's really quite something. Who would have thought? Yeah, his name is Obama. And that's how some of these people. Joe Biden is part of that group. Joe Biden's like when Hillary Clinton tries to opportunistically race grift and talks about hot sauce in her purse and stuff like that. But then you look back at the 90s when she's running for a Senate position in a population that at the time was far whiter, was worried about, you know, diversity and stuff like that. There were race riots and stuff. What does she say? She calls these people super predators. Biden literally echoing that with his chat about predators in several hearings in the U.S. Senate. He said the same sorts of things that Hillary Clinton did. This did become at least a little bit of a problem for Hillary. Biden's got worse. He's got more of a track record to pick apart. And because of his relatively hard-hitting status for so many years, he gave way more speeches where he had opportunities to say stuff that no longer holds up to modern standards, especially within the Democratic Party. At some point, a fair comparison of Trump's last 50 years versus Biden's last 50 years. And this is really a fundamental sum and substance of the problem. If you compare the two, you will find that Trump was the one that was more progressive. Biden was the one that was more traditionalistic. That's what a full scrutiny of the track record, not just politically, but public statements made. And both of these dudes have massive amounts of public statements dating back to the 70s and stuff. You've got a million interviews. You've got a million impromptu speeches. You've got Trump's presidency. You've got Biden's vice presidency. You've got his Senate career. You've got Trump's business career. All of the decisions made should be weighed against one another, and you'll be able to see who the real bigot really is, according to the standards of large segments of the left. At the end of the day, it's going to be, I think, impossible for Biden to enthuse the left, partially because of that. He can't run on having been a principled progressive. He never acted even quasi-progressive till he was VP, and then the Obama presidency takes credit for LGBT rights and fly the gay flag and stuff. SCOTUS made its decision. Literally the only contribution that either of these dudes made was not defending DOMA. That's the only thing that they did. Biden's story, like his story about how, oh, my dad was a great progressive, by the way, too. Back in the 50s, he said it was okay if gay men kissed in the street. No, they probably got arrested for that back then. Your dad probably did not tell you it was okay. I call bullshit on your story. Wasn't a lot of progressivism with regards to that back in the 1950s. Although it was known. People pretend that things were more puritanical and that it wasn't kind of a facade, but I mean, it wasn't out in the open. No, it wasn't, Joe. I doubt that you even saw that happen. Maybe you're misremembering. Maybe you saw it in the 1990s and it was you telling your kid that it was okay. That I could believe. You know, maybe by then you're like, yeah, who fucking cares? You know, at least they're paying taxes or something. He's lost in a racial jungle of his own last 50 years of nonstop political rhetoric. If he's lived long enough to become the villain that he once would have maybe fought. He's lived long enough to have become sort of the antithesis of what his own partisan backdrop now stands for. They've left him behind. His views largely don't seem to have changed. He's struggling to pretend that he's some sort of progressive. That he's sort of, I was big into racial justice and gay rights and third wave feminism, and I want more taxes for more welfare. That's not what he stood for. He was sort of just a law and order standard neoliberal for his entire career. That's why he passed the tough on crime legislation of the 90s. He was one of the main proponents. He was one of the main figures at the center of that. He wasn't some secondary senator who sat off to the side and just voted yay on the legislation. He was one of the chief architects of something that put hundreds of thousands of young black men in prison under extended sentences for petty crimes, nonviolent crimes, that extended the sentencing guidelines for drug convictions, even nonviolent simple possession. A lot of people, some in prison probably today with extensive rap sheets, have Joe Biden to thank for that. Meanwhile, Trump is involved with the Three Steps Act, which he helped to author. Helped get some of these people back out of prison and clean part of their rap sheets off so they could get a fucking job. So they wouldn't have to deal drugs anymore because now they're actually capable of doing something meaningful and gainful in the form of employment. Trump just wants their tax money. He doesn't care about anything else. He doesn't care if they're black. That's about all. Peace out.